A pirate captain has just taken the richest prize of his career. The hold is packed with silk, spices, silver coin, and gemstones worth more than most men will see in 10 lifetimes. And yet, standing on that deck, surrounded by more wealth than he can count, the captain is still poor. None of it is money yet. It is cargo with no market, coin with no bank, silk with no buyer willing to ask where it came from. A pirate without someone to sell to is not rich. He is just a man guarding a warehouse that floats. This is the part of the golden age of piracy that the movies never show you. The cutlass and the black flag get all the attention, but behind almost every famous raid, there was a quieter figure waiting on shore. A man in a clean coat with a ledger instead of a sword, ready to turn blood money into ordinary money. He never boarded a ship. He never fired a shot. And in many cases, he ended up far richer than the pirate who did all the killing. Today we are going to follow that money. Not the muskets, not the mutinies, but the sail. Because the truth is that piracy in the late 1600s and early 1700s was never just an act of violence at sea. It was a supply chain. Stolen silk from the Indian Ocean did not stay stolen for long. It moved through warehouses, through false paperwork, through the hands of merchants who were pillars of their communities, and it came out the other side looking exactly like legitimate cargo. Somewhere between the deck of a pirate ship and the shelf of a colonial shop, the crime simply disappeared. We are going to name names, real merchants, real governors, real ports where this happened, verified through court records, colonial correspondence, and the testimony pirates themselves gave when they were finally caught. Some of these men are barely remembered today, yet during their lifetimes, they were wealthier and more politically connected than any pirate captain who ever lived. One of them would go on to have a river named after his family. Another sat on a governor's council while quietly bankrolling a pirate colony on the other side of the world. A third dealt in diamonds so valuable that the pirate who brought them to market never fully recovered from the transaction. This was not a hidden underworld operating in the shadows of respectable society. In several ports, it was respectable society. And that is the real reason the golden age of piracy could exist at all. Piracy is often described as a rebellion against empire, a life chosen by men who refused to work within the system. There is some truth in that, but the system these men refused to work within was the very same system that made their crimes profitable. Colonial economies in the late 1600s ran on scarcity. Goods from Asia were taxed, restricted, and funneled through a small number of approved companies back in Europe. For an ordinary merchant sitting in a colonial port, legal trade meant high prices, long delays, and thin profit margins. A pirate ship arriving with a hold full of unregistered silk and gemstones was not a threat to that merchant. It was an opportunity. No tax, no paperwork, no questions, as long as both sides agreed not to ask them. So a strange and quiet economy grew up around piracy, one where captains provided the goods and merchants provided the market, the false invoices, and, in more than a few cases, the political protection needed to keep the whole operation running for years. We are going to walk through exactly how that worked, who ran it, and how it eventually collapsed, not because pirates stopped stealing, but because the men who bought from them finally had a reason to stop buying. By the end of this video, you will understand why the golden age of piracy did not end with better ships or braver naval officers. It ended when the market for stolen goods was forced to close. And you will see why the most dangerous man in this story was never the one holding the sword. Popular legend paints the pirate as a lone outlaw, cut off from civilization, surviving purely on nerve and violence. The historical record tells a different story. Court depositions, customs records, and merchant correspondence from this period show a pirate economy that was deeply woven into ordinary colonial commerce, dependent on bankers, ship owners, and even government officials who took a cut and looked away. The outlaw needed the insider far more than the insider needed the outlaw. And once you see that partnership clearly, the entire golden age of piracy starts to look less like chaos and more like business. Consider the scale of what we are talking about. A single successful raid on a merchant vessel in the Indian Ocean could produce cargo worth more than the entire annual budget of a small colonial town. That kind of wealth does not simply vanish into a pirate's pocket. It has to move through a chain of hands, each one taking a cut, each one adding a layer of distance between the theft and the final sale. By the time a length of stolen silk reached a customer in a colonial shop, it might have passed through a broker on a remote island, a ship captain paid to look the other way, a merchant with a warehouse full of falsified paperwork, and finally a shopkeeper who never once asked where the goods had come from. Every person in that chain took a share of the profit, and every person in that chain bore almost none of the risk that the pirate himself carried. That imbalance sits at the heart of everything we are about to uncover. To understand why merchants were willing to buy from pirates, you first have to understand how badly the colonial trade system was broken for anyone trying to do business honestly. In the late 1600s, England controlled trade with its colonies through a set of laws known as the Navigation Acts. Under these laws, colonial merchants were forbidden from trading certain goods directly with foreign markets. Everything had to pass through English ports first, get taxed, get inspected, and then travel back across the ocean before it could legally reach a colonial shelf. For a merchant in New York or Boston or Newport, this meant that a simple bolt of silk from India could take months to arrive and cost a fortune once it did, assuming it arrived at all. Meanwhile, out in the Indian Ocean, that exact same silk was sitting in the hold of a pirate ship, already stolen, already free of any tax, and already looking for a buyer who would not ask too many questions. From a purely economic standpoint, the choice facing a colonial merchant was brutal. Trade honestly and struggle against high costs and long delays, or trade with pirates and access the same goods for a fraction of the price, no paperwork required. Many merchants chose the second option, and colonial governments in this period were not equipped, and in many cases not willing, to stop them. This is the part of pirate history that rarely makes it into films or popular retellings. The image most people carry is of pirates as isolated criminals hiding on remote islands cut off from the rest of the world. The reality documented in court records from Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island shows something closer to an open secret. Entire port towns depended on pirate trade to stay economically competitive. Officials in these colonies were appointed by distant authorities in London, who had little ability to enforce compliance from thousands of miles away, and many colonial governors quickly realized that turning a blind eye to piracy in exchange for a share of the profits was far more lucrative than actually stopping it. Rhode Island in particular developed a reputation among naval officers of the period as a safe harbor for pirate goods, a place where a captain could sell his plunder, resupply his ship, and sail off again with almost no interference. Newport, its principal port, grew wealthy in part on trade connections that colonial officials in London repeatedly complained about, but rarely managed to shut down, since the colony's own leadership had every financial incentive to keep the arrangement quiet. Nassau in the Bahamas developed a similar reputation somewhat later, becoming so associated with pirate trade that the surrounding waters eventually earned the nickname the Pirate Republic among sailors of the period, a place where stolen goods moved almost as freely as legitimate cargo. The men who ran this system on the ground were known at the time as receivers, a legal term still used today for anyone who knowingly buys or holds stolen property. In the pirate economy of the late 1700s, receivers were often among the wealthiest and most respected men in their communities. They were ship owners, customs officials, even members of colonial councils, and their involvement gave the entire operation a level of legitimacy that pure banditry never could have achieved on its own. A receiver's job was straightforward in principle, even if it required real skill and practice. He needed to accept goods from a pirate crew, often at a steep discount because the pirates themselves had no other buyers and no leverage to negotiate. He needed to disguise the origin of those goods, usually through false bills of sale, claiming they came from a legitimate voyage. And he needed political cover, either through bribery, personal connections, or simply operating in a jurisdiction too far from London to be closely watched. When all three pieces were in place, the system worked with remarkable efficiency. Stolen silk from a ship in the Indian Ocean could realistically end up on sale in a colonial port within a matter of months, its criminal origin completely erased on paper. The false paperwork itself deserves attention because it was often surprisingly simple. A receiver might claim that goods had come from a legitimate trading voyage to a distant port, one far enough away that no customs official in the colonies could realistically verify the claim before the goods were already sold and dispersed among local buyers. Ship captains willing to falsify a manifest could be paid handsomely for the risk, and once a cargo had passed through even one layer of fraudulent documentation, it became extraordinarily difficult for anyone downstream to trace it back to its true origin. This was not a small or occasional arrangement. According to surviving trade correspondence from the period, several major colonial ports processed enough pirate goods during the 1690s to represent a meaningful share of their total commerce. The men behind this trade were not hiding in back alleys. They were writing letters, chartering ships, and building fortunes that would outlast the golden age of piracy itself by generations. In the next part of this story, we are going to look at one of the most well-documented examples of this entire system in action, a partnership between a pirate who built an entire trading post on the other side of the world and one of the wealthiest merchants in New York, a partnership so successful that its profits helped build one of the largest private landholdings in colonial American history. In the middle of the 1680s, a man named Adam Baldridge fled the English colony of Jamaica after being accused of murder. He sailed east, eventually settling on a small island called St. Mary's just off the coast of Madagascar. It was remote, poorly monitored by any European power, and perfectly positioned along the shipping routes that pirates used to hunt merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean. Baldridge built a fortified trading post there, complete with a warehouse and defensive guns overlooking the harbor. Pirates sailing back from raids on wealthy trading ships could stop at his post, sell their stolen cargo, resupply their ships, and rest before heading out again. But Baldridge needed something too. A trading post is only useful if it has goods to sell back to the pirates in exchange for their plunder, things like food, ammunition, cloth, and liquor. For that, he needed a reliable supplier back in the colonies, someone with the ships, the capital, and the willingness to look the other way. He found that man in Frederick Philipse, one of the wealthiest merchants in New York and a sitting member of the Colonial Governor's Council. Philipse was, by most accounts of the period, the richest man in New York. He had built his fortune through legitimate trade and property, and by the 1690s he saw an opportunity to expand it dramatically through his connection to Baldridge. Between the years 1693 and 1699, Philip sent his own ships on repeated voyages to Madagascar, carrying exactly the kind of supplies Baldridge needed to keep his trading post running. In return, the ships came back loaded with goods that pirates had taken from ships across the Indian Ocean: silk, spices, and other valuable cargo that could be quietly sold in New York at enormous profit. This was not a rumor or a piece of folklore passed down through pirate legend. It is documented through surviving correspondence between Baldridge and Philipse, in which Baldridge directly discusses trading goods, and through colonial records confirming the voyages of Philipse's ships between New York and Madagascar during this exact period. The arrangement worked because it had protection at the highest level of colonial government. Benjamin Fletcher, the governor of New York at the time, was widely known among his contemporaries to accept payments from men involved in the pirate trade in exchange for allowing their ships to enter port without the scrutiny that customs officials would normally apply. Letters from the period describe Fletcher personally receiving gifts, including at least one ship, from men benefiting from pirate trade and openly favoring merchants connected to it. With a governor willing to look away and a merchant willing to fund the operation, the entire system between New York and Madagascar functioned almost like a legitimate shipping company, except that one end of every voyage involved goods taken by force on the other side of the world. It is worth pausing here on the fact versus myth of this story, because popular pirate legend often casts colonial governors as helpless victims of piracy, struggling against forces they could not control. The historical record from New York during Fletcher's time shows something closer to willing partnership. Fletcher was eventually removed from his post, specifically because of his ties to pirate trade, a clear sign that colonial authorities in London understood exactly what was happening, even if they were slow to act on it. Philipse, notably, was never removed from his position and never faced serious legal consequence for his role in supplying a known pirate haven. His fortune, built in part through this trade, helped establish one of the largest private landholdings in colonial New York history, land that would remain in his family for generations after his death, eventually becoming known through the family name attached to it in the region around the Hudson River. Baldridge, for his part, did not enjoy the same lasting legacy. His relationship with the local Malagasy population soured over time, partly due to his own involvement in capturing and selling people into slavery alongside his trade in pirate goods, a detail often left out of the more romanticized versions of his story. In 1697, years of resentment among the people living near his trading post erupted into violence, and Baldridge was forced to abandon St. Mary's entirely, fleeing with whatever wealth he could carry while the settlement he had built collapsed behind him. The Madagascar trade eventually became difficult to sustain, not because authorities cracked down effectively, but because increased scrutiny from customs officials in Europe made it harder to disguise the origin of the goods coming back into port. In one notable case, a shipment connected to Philipse was seized in a foreign port after officials there recognized that its cargo bore all the signs of illegal trade with pirates. The financial loss was significant, and it marked one of the first visible cracks in a system that had operated with almost no interference for nearly a decade. What this story shows is that the golden age of piracy did not run on courage or violence alone. It ran on logistics, on shipping routes, on trusted partnerships between men who never set foot on a pirate ship, but who understood exactly how profitable that ship's cargo could become once it reached the right buyer. If Baldridge and Philipse show how the system worked when it succeeded, the story of Henry Every and his diamonds shows exactly how it could fall apart, and how the men who bought stolen goods could turn on the very pirates who trusted them. In 1695, Every and his crew captured one of the richest prizes in the entire history of piracy, a Mughal treasure ship named the Ganj-i-Sawai, loaded with gold, silver, and gemstones worth an amount that would translate to tens of millions of dollars today. Each member of Every's crew walked away with a personal fortune, more money than most laborers of the era would earn across an entire lifetime, distributed according to a share system common among pirate crews of the period, where the captain typically received a larger portion, while ordinary sailors split the remainder more or less evenly, a structure that, ironically, was often more equitable than the wages offered aboard legitimate merchant or naval vessels of the same era. But a fortune in stolen diamonds is not the same as a fortune in usable wealth. Every and his men needed to convert their plunder into something they could actually spend without drawing attention, and that meant finding buyers willing to accept goods everyone in the English-speaking world was actively hunting for. Every first sailed to the Bahamas, where the governor of Nassau, a man named Nicholas Trott, accepted bribes from the crew in exchange for shelter and resupply, even allowing Every to hand over his own ship as part of the arrangement. When word eventually reached Trott that a massive manhunt was underway for the very men he had been sheltering, he warned them privately before any formal arrest could be made, giving Every and his crew time to scatter. This alone tells you how deeply embedded the receiving system had become. A sitting colonial governor chose to protect a wanted pirate rather than enforce the law, because the bribes he had already received were worth more to him than his duty to the crown. The hunt for Every and his crew became, by most historical accounts, the first manhunt of its kind to span the entire English-speaking world, with wanted notices and bounties issued across colonies and ports that had never before coordinated on pursuing a single group of criminals. That scale alone tells you how much damage the Ganj-i-Sawai raid had done, not just financially but diplomatically, since the ruler whose ship had been plundered held enough power to threaten English trading interests across the region in retaliation. From the Bahamas, Every and a portion of his crew eventually made their way toward the British Isles, carrying a portion of the diamonds taken from the Mughal ship. According to the earliest surviving accounts of his story, Every attempted to sell these diamonds to merchants in Bristol, men whose business was built on exactly this kind of quiet, high-value trade. But here the story takes a turn that pirate legend loves to repeat, and that historians still cannot fully confirm. By some accounts, the Bristol merchants who agreed to buy Every's diamonds simply cheated him, offering a fraction of their true value and refusing to pay even that once the goods were in their possession. Every, according to this version of events, had no way to demand fair payment or take legal action, because doing so would have exposed his own identity to the very authorities hunting him. If this account is accurate, one of the most successful pirates in history was ultimately robbed not by a rival captain or a naval patrol, but by the same class of respectable merchant who had made piracy profitable in the first place. This is where fact and myth blur together in a way that is worth being honest about. We cannot confirm with certainty what happened to Every after his crew scattered, and no reliable historical record shows what became of him. What we can confirm is the broader pattern his story reveals, that pirates operating outside the law had almost no protection once they tried to convert stolen wealth into usable money, and that the merchants on the other side of these transactions held all the leverage. A pirate could not report a merchant for cheating him. He could not sue for fair payment. He could only accept whatever price he was offered, because the alternative was carrying diamonds he could never safely spend. This imbalance is a large part of why the receiving system eventually began to collapse. As authorities in London grew more aware of exactly how deeply pirate trade had penetrated colonial commerce, they began targeting not just the pirates themselves, but the governors and merchants who supported them. Fletcher's removal from office in New York, Trott's exposure in the Bahamas, and increasingly aggressive prosecutions of known receivers throughout the early 1700s sent a clear message to the merchant class that had profited quietly for decades. Buying from pirates was no longer a safe, invisible transaction. It carried real legal and financial risk, and as that risk increased, the willingness of respectable merchants to participate in it began to fade. Parliament itself eventually passed new legislation specifically targeting piracy and its financial supporters, expanding the definition of criminal involvement to include anyone who knowingly bought, sold, or profited from pirate goods, not just the men who actually carried out the raids. For the first time, a merchant sitting comfortably in a colonial warehouse faced roughly the same legal exposure as the pirate crew that had delivered the stolen cargo to his door. And that single shift in the law did more to end the golden age of piracy than any naval campaign that followed it. By the early 1700s, the golden age of piracy was entering its final years, and most accounts of why focus entirely on enforcement at sea. More naval patrols, better armed merchant convoys, more aggressive hunting of pirate captains. All of that is true, and all of it mattered. But it misses the quieter, less dramatic reason piracy became so much harder to sustain as a livelihood. The market closed. When men like Frederick Philipse could operate for years with almost no consequence, piracy remained enormously profitable, not just for the pirates themselves, but for an entire network of merchants, governors, and ship owners who depended on that trade. Once colonial authorities began actually prosecuting receivers, once governors like Fletcher and Trott were exposed and removed, and once respectable merchants understood that buying stolen goods now carried real risk to their fortunes and their freedom, the incentive structure that had made piracy sustainable simply collapsed. A pirate crew could still capture a ship full of silk and silver. What they increasingly could not do was find anyone safe to sell it to. This is, in a strange way, the least romantic and most important truth about the entire golden age of piracy. It was never simply a story of outlaws defying civilization. It was a story of civilization quietly profiting from those outlaws, right up until the moment it became too dangerous to keep doing so. The pirate captain with the black flag makes for a better legend than the merchant with the ledger, but the merchant is the one who actually decided how long the golden age would last. Every economic system, legal or otherwise, depends on willing participants at every stage, and piracy was no exception. Take away the buyer, and the entire structure of profit that made piracy worth the risk starts to fall apart, no matter how skilled or fearless the men doing the actual stealing might be. There is a broader lesson buried in this story that reaches well beyond pirate history. Crime on this scale rarely survives on its own. It survives because ordinary, respectable institutions find it convenient to look away, or profitable to participate quietly, right up until the moment the risk outweighs the reward. Frederick Philipse never boarded a pirate ship, never threatened a sailor, and never fired a weapon in anger. Yet his fortune was built in significant part on stolen goods taken by force from people thousands of miles away. He faced no meaningful consequence in his lifetime, while the men who actually carried out the violence he profited from were hunted, hanged, or forced into permanent hiding. That imbalance should sit uncomfortably with anyone hearing this story for the first time, because it complicates the version of pirate history most of us grew up with. The one where the outlaw is the villain and everyone standing on shore is innocent by default. The real golden age of piracy was never that simple. It was a partnership between men willing to take violent risks at sea and men willing to take quiet financial risks on land, and history has been far kinder to the second group than it probably should be. So the next time you hear the story of a legendary pirate raid, the ship boarded, the treasure seized, the black flag raised in triumph, it is worth asking the question the movies almost never do. Who was waiting on shore to buy it? Because somewhere in every one of these stories, there was a man in a clean coat, holding a ledger instead of a sword, quietly deciding how the crime would end, and in most cases, he walked away from it far richer and far freer than the man who actually took the risk. History remembers the names of the captains because their stories were loud, violent, and easy to turn into legend. It remembers far fewer of the merchants, even though their decisions shaped the entire era just as much, if not more. Frederick Philipse died a wealthy landowner, respected within his community until the end of his life. Adam Baldridge disappeared from the historical record after fleeing Madagascar, his fortune and his fate largely unknown. Henry Every vanished entirely, and no one has ever confirmed how or where his story ended. Only the pirates who were caught faced the full weight of the law, while the men who made their crimes profitable in the first place mostly walked free, protected by distance, by wealth, and by a system that was never truly designed to hold them accountable. That is not a comfortable ending, and it is not meant to be. The golden age of piracy did not close because good triumphed cleanly over evil. It closed because one side of a corrupt partnership finally became too expensive to maintain. And when that happened, the men holding the ledgers simply moved on to safer business, leaving history to remember the pirates and quietly forget the merchants who made them rich in the first place.